In 1898, a photographer developed his negatives from the Shroud of Turin and saw something that should have been impossible. The image on the cloth was a perfect photographic negative, centuries before photography existed. That single discovery started a chain of questions that science has never fully answered. And when Tucker Carlson sat down with the expert who has spent his life studying it, he ran into the same wall.
These would have been the dimensions of a burial shroud.
Correct.
In that period.
In the 1st century in antiquity.
Is it a continuously woven piece of cloth? That's one piece of cloth?
It is. Pure linen.
Pure linen. What is linen?
With a herringbone weave. It's made from the flax plant, and this has a unique herringbone.
The cloth itself is not unusual. Linen burial cloths from antiquity exist. They have been preserved. They have been studied. The dimensions of the shroud match what would be expected from a 1st century burial garment. The weave pattern is consistent with high-quality linen from that time. None of that creates tension on its own. It sits comfortably within what is already known. What creates tension is what Tucker is then shown, because embedded in that linen is the image of a man, not applied onto the surface, not painted or dyed, present within the fibers themselves. And that image behaves in a way that does not align with any known method of image formation. It exists, it can be studied, but it cannot be explained. And that distinction changes the entire direction of the conversation, because the question Tucker is now facing is no longer whether the shroud is meaningful. The question becomes how something like that is physically possible. And that is where the explanation begins to shift from interpretation to mechanism.
If this was a work of art, if there was pigment, if there was dye, if there was paint, it would absorb fully. But if we took a razor to the actual shroud, we could shave off the image because it's that thin. And this is what the best scientists in the world cannot replicate.
The image does not behave the way an artificial image should. If it were painted, the pigment would penetrate the fibers. If it were dyed, the color would spread through the threads. At the same time, the blood on the cloth behaves exactly as real blood should. It soaks through the fibers, it transfers, it follows the patterns expected from a physical body. That contrast is what creates the problem, because it means 2 different processes are happening on the same material, and only one of them is understood. And that is where Tucker stops pushing back and starts listening more carefully, because now it is not just unusual. It is internally inconsistent in a way that cannot be resolved by a simple explanation. And the more the expert explains, the less it fits into anything familiar. The expert does not move to conclusions, he moves to details, the injuries on the body, the placement of the wounds, the patterns that appear across the image, because each one of those details aligns with what is known about Roman crucifixion, and not in a general sense, but in a specific measurable way. And there are scourge marks across the front and back of the body distributed in a pattern consistent with flagellation. There is a wound in the side positioned between the ribs in a way that matches historical descriptions. There are blood flows that indicate both pre-mortem and post-mortem conditions. Each one of these details can be examined independently. Each one of them holds up. That is where the pattern begins to form. And Tucker can see that happening in real time because individually these could be dismissed. A wound could be imagined, a pattern could be coincidental, but together they begin to reinforce each other. And once that reinforcement starts, the idea of randomness becomes harder to maintain. The face is where that pattern becomes difficult to ignore because the face is not abstract. It is not symbolic. It carries structure, proportion, damage that corresponds to the rest of the body. And Tucker is not being asked to imagine it. He is being shown it directly.
It's so much clearer
Right.
in this is photographic negative.
Right. The negative is actually the positive. And so if you trace and go to the back, I want you to look at the back of the image, the head, the blood, the back, all of those hash marks, the abrasions. I estimate there are 700 wounds on the crucified man of the shroud.
That becomes even more pronounced when the image is inverted because the shroud behaves like a photographic negative. The negative produces a clearer image than the cloth itself. That is not a stylistic effect. It is a physical property. And it was only discovered when the first photograph was taken in 1898. That is the moment that changes the tone of the conversation. Not because something new is being claimed, but because Tucker is now looking at something that should not exist in that form. A negative image, produced centuries before photography, embedded in a material that shows no signs of artificial manipulation. At that point, the question becomes unavoidable. If it is not painted, and it is not dyed, and it is not mechanically applied, then what produced it? The expert does not try to fill that gap with speculation. He leaves it where it is, because the absence of an explanation is not the same as the presence of a conclusion. And that distinction is what keeps Tucker from interrupting. The conversation is no longer moving toward a claim. It is moving toward a boundary.
And so the scholar said, whatever you do, don't carbon date the corners of the shroud because it's been so contaminated. It's a contaminated sample. Get in the middle of the shroud and carbon date those samples.
That problem becomes more difficult when earlier conclusions are revisited. The radiocarbon dating that once placed the shroud in the medieval period was later challenged. The sample used for testing was shown to come from a repaired section of the cloth, not the original material. That does not prove the shroud is older, but it removes the certainty that it is not. And once that certainty is gone, the entire timeline becomes unstable, which means the evidence has to be reconsidered without relying on that conclusion. At that point, the conversation is no longer moving forward, and Tucker can feel that happening as each explanation leads back to the same place. Not enough to prove anything. Enough to prevent closure. That is what makes the shroud different from most historical artifacts. It does not settle into a single category, it resists being fully explained, and the more it is studied, the more that resistance becomes the defining feature. The expert makes that clear without overstating it. He does not say the shroud proves anything. He says something more precise. That the science has reached a point where it can describe the object in detail, but it cannot account for its origin. And that gap remains. That is where the conversation shifts again, because when something has been examined across disciplines, tested repeatedly, and still cannot be explained, the absence of an answer becomes part of the evidence, not as proof, but as a limitation. That limitation is what Tucker Carlson is reacting to, not a claim being made, but a boundary being reached, a point where the available tools no longer produce an explanation. And what remains is the object itself, unchanged by the attempt to define it. That is why the moment lands the way it does, not because it resolves anything, but because it removes the assumption that it already has been resolved. It reopens a question that many people assumed was closed. And once that question is open again, the conversation changes, because it is no longer about choosing between belief and disbelief. It is about accounting for something that continues to exist without a sufficient explanation. That is what left Tucker Carlson speechless, not the certainty of an answer, the absence of one.